Imagine yourself sitting under a baobab tree in Senegal, the red, dusty soil beneath your fingers. In front of you, a wooden board with 12 hollows, filled with shiny tamarind seeds. This is a whale, a strategy game so ancient that it was already played in the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, over 4,000 years ago. Each time you move a seed, you repeat a millennial gesture, a gesture that tells the story of African trade, diplomacy, and collective thought. Pan-Africanism is not just a political idea born in the 20th century in the salons of London or Paris. It is also a sensory experience, a network of flavors, textures, and sounds that have connected the peoples of the continent for centuries. The excerpts from the Alkebulan Academy Library, though fragmentary, offer us precious clues. In 12 Years a Slave, we read the testimony of a life torn apart by the slave trade, but also the resistance of a culture that refuses to die. In Africa's slave trade, Frank's story among the rancheros shows how identities blended in 19th century America, while African-American poetry evokes the songs and prayers of a people in exile. These texts, though not political treatises, speak to us of resistance, memory, and creation. Today, we will approach Pan-Africanism not through Congress speeches, but through play, taste, smell, and touch. We will touch the seeds of a whale, smell the incense of the Horn of Africa, taste okra and millet, and listen to the rhythms of the drum. For African unity was also built in daily gestures, in trade exchanges, and in shared leisure. This course offers you a sensory journey through time and space, to understand how games and the senses shaped a collective consciousness, long before the word Pan-Africanism was invented. Get ready to touch, smell, taste, and listen to history, a whale and mankala, strategy, trade, and collective thought. The first gesture of this course is a gesture of play. A whale, or mankala, is a board game played on a board with 2 rows of holes, using seeds or stones. Its name comes from the Arabic word nakala, meaning to move. This game is found throughout Africa, from ancient Egypt to South Africa, including Ghana, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. In the document 12 Years a Slave, we read the story of a man who, torn from his land, carried with him the rules of the game learned in his childhood. The game is not mere entertainment, it is a school of strategic thinking and resource management. Each seed represents a unit of value, a sack of millet, a head of cattle. By playing, one learns to count, to anticipate, to negotiate. Historians estimate that mankala is the ancestor of all modern board games, and that it was exported to Asia and the Americas via trans-Saharan trade routes and the Atlantic slave trade.
Root Africans, becoming a symbol of resistance and memory on American plantations. Touching the seeds of a whale is touching a history of trade networks that united West Africa with the Nile Basin, long before the arrival of Europeans. The game is also a tool of diplomacy. In the royal courts of Dahomey or Congo, offering in a whale board was a gesture of alliance. The seeds, often tamarind seeds or polished stones, were exchanged as currency. By playing, war chiefs learned to resolve conflicts without violence, through symbolic competition. Pan-Africanism, in its most ancient dimension, is therefore a practice of play, a way of thinking about the collective through strategy. The excerpts from African American poetry remind us that work songs and spirituals were also rhythmic games, ways of synchronizing bodies and minds. A whale teaches us that unity is not decreed, it is built move by move, seed by seed, in a dialogue between players. This is the lesson that the early Pan-Africanists, like W.E.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey, integrated. African unity requires collective strategy, equitable distribution of resources, and a shared memory of ancient gestures, the flavors of unity, cuisine, spices, and trade routes. If play is a vector of thought, food is a vector of memory. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in a West African kitchen. You smell the aroma of simmering okra, dried fish, red palm oil. You hear the pestle pounding millet in a wooden mortar. These smells and sounds are markers of a culinary identity that crosses the Atlantic. In the document 12 Years a Slave, the narrator describes meals on the plantation: cornbread, salted pork, sweet potatoes. But he also evokes, in the background, recipes learned in Africa, ways of cooking okra, seasoning with chili and ginger. Cuisine is a language. Spices, guinea pepper, cinnamon, cloves were at the heart of trans-Saharan trade and the incense route. Incense, indeed, is another key sensory experience. In A Tramp's Sketches, Stephen Graham describes Russian pilgrims burning incense in Greek monasteries. But incense is also an African essence, harvested in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, and traded since antiquity with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. Smelling incense is smelling a history of trade routes that connected Africa to Asia and Europe, long before colonization. These routes were also routes of unity. Swahili merchants, Tuaregs, houses created exchange networks that mixed cultures. Pan-Africanism is also this history of culinary blending. Okra, native to West Africa, became a central ingredient of Louisiana gumbo. Millet, sorghum, African rice fed slaves in the Americas, and their descendants transformed these ingredients into identity dishes. In AFR,
tea reduced to an abstract political idea. It has lived in kitchens, in spice markets, in the gestures of meal preparation. Culinary exchanges between Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean are living proof that African peoples have always been connected, despite the violence of the slave trade. By learning to recognize the flavors of Africa, one learns to recognize a common history, the touch of textiles, Kent, Bogolan, and Pan-African identity. After play and food, the third sense that guides us is touch. Run your fingers over a Kent cloth, from Ghana. You feel the hand-woven strips of silk and cotton, the geometric patterns that tell proverbs and stories of royalty. Kent is a Pan-African symbol. It was worn by independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, and today it is worn in African diasporas during graduation ceremonies or weddings. Bogolan, or mud cloth, from Mali, has a rough texture, dyed with fermented mud and plant decoctions. Each pattern has a meaning. The crocodile symbolizes strength, the snake wisdom. Touching these fabrics is touching a history of artisanal techniques passed down through generations. In the document Frank Among the Rancheros, the character Frank meets Mexican artisans who weave blankets and ponchos. But the text also reminds us that weaving techniques were brought to America by African slaves. Indigo blankets, dyed with an African plant, were a status marker on plantations. The touch of African textiles connects us to an economy of exchange and creation. Fabrics were traded along caravan routes, from Timbuktu to Jan, from West Africa to North Africa. Pan-Africanism is also the recognition of these shared know-hows. The patterns of Kent are found in Kuba cloth from Congo, in raffia fabrics from Cameroon. By touching these materials, one touches a cultural unity that predates colonial borders. Pan-African leaders, like Leopold Sédar Senghor, often wore Bogolan or Kent garments at international conferences, to assert a proud and distinct African identity. Textile is a political language. It says, "We are not copies of Europeans, we have our own aesthetic, our own history." By training yourself to recognize the textures of African fabrics by touch, you develop a Pan-African sensibility. You learn to identify techniques, origins, meanings. Touch becomes a tool of historical knowledge. The smell of history, incense, medicinal plants, and routes of the soul. The fourth sense we mobilize is smell. In the document A Tramp's Sketches, Stephen Graham describes the smell of incense in Orthodox churches in Jerusalem. But incense, myrrh, cedar, sandalwood are African essences. The Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia and Ethiopia, was the main supplier of incense and myrrh to the ancient world. Egypti.
Religious texts, agricultural techniques, musical instruments. The smell of incense, for an African of the diaspora, can evoke the memory of a lost land, an ancestral ritual. In African American poetry, poems often speak of the smell of Black American churches, a mix of incense, sweat, and polished wood. This smell is a link to Africa, a reminder that African religious practices survived in the Christianity and Islam of the diasporas. Medicinal plants are another olfactory aspect of Pan-Africanism. Neem, aloe vera, moringa are African plants used for centuries for healing. Their characteristic smell is unmistakable. In the document 12 Years a Slave, the narrator mentions the use of plants to treat wounds, knowledge transmitted orally. Sensory Pan-Africanism invites us to recognize this knowledge as a common heritage. The Organization of African Unity, created in 1963, included in its programs the promotion of traditional medicine. Smelling the scent of neem is smelling a history of health resistance, community care. The roots of incense and medicinal plants are the invisible roots of African unity. They remind us that Africa was never isolated. The smells of the continent traveled, mixed, created bridges between cultures. By learning to recognize these smells, you learn to read an olfactory cartography of Pan-African history (SEP). To go further in this sensory approach to Pan-Africanism, we must examine how games, flavors, textiles, and smells were used as tools of resistance and identity reaffirmation in the context of the Atlantic slave trade and colonization. The document 12 Years a Slave offers us direct testimony of the living conditions of slaves on American plantations. The narrator, Solomon Northup, describes how slaves used work songs and nursery rhymes to communicate among themselves, despite the prohibition of speaking their mother tongue. These songs were a form of vocal play, a secret code that allowed the transmission of information and maintained a link with African culture. Similarly, Mancala games were often played in secret, in the slave quarters, as an act of cultural resistance. The board was dug into the earth, the seeds were pebbles picked up in the fields. This simple gesture, repeated every evening, kept alive African strategic thinking. In Frank Among the Rancheros, we see how exchanges between cultures create hybridizations. Frank, a young American, learns to play Mexican and Native American games, and he shares his knowledge. This reminds us that Pan-Africanism is not a fixed essentialism. It is dynamic, open to external influences, but always rooted in an African matrix. Creole cuisines, for example, are the result of mixtures of African, European, and Native American ingredients.
Regions, but also by African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. They have become symbols of Pan-African solidarity. At the Bandung Conference in 1955, African delegates often wore traditional clothing to assert their identity against colonial powers. Smell, finally, is a sense often neglected in history. Yet, deported Africans carried with them seeds of aromatic plants, recipes for spice blends. The smell of curry, chili, ginger in Caribbean kitchens is an African smell. Fumigation rituals, with incense or sage, are practiced in Afro-diasporic religions like Candomblé or Santeria. These practices are direct inheritances from Africa. By deepening this approach, we can also study the works of historians like Joseph Kizerbo or Chikanta Diop, who showed that Africa has always been a continent of circulation, exchange, and cultural creation. Games, flavors, textiles, and smells are tangible proofs of this history. They are the sensory archives of Pan-Africanism (SEP). To understand and remember this course well, I propose a three-step method. First, sensory experimentation. If possible, get an whale board or draw one on a sheet. Play with seeds or marbles. Each time you move a seed, ask yourself, what exchange does this seed represent in African history? Then, train yourself to recognize smells and flavors. Go to an African or exotic grocery store and smell the spices, teas, incenses. Note in a notebook what each smell evokes for you. Finally, read the excerpts from the Alkebulan Academy Library documents, focusing on sensory descriptions. In 12 Years a Slave, note the passages that talk about food, clothing, songs. In your tramp sketches, note the smells and textures. Link each description to a notion of Pan-Africanism. To remember dates and names, create sensory associations. For example, associate the year 1963, creation of the OA, with the smell of incense, because that year, African leaders signed the charter in a perfumed room. Use memory cards with fabric samples glued on them. Touch the fabric and recite the information. Turn learning into a game. Create a sensory quiz where you must identify an African country from a smell or texture. This method will allow you to memorize durably, because it engages several senses at once. SEP. To deepen this course, I recommend several readings and activities. First, read the source documents from the Alkebulan Academy Library in full. 12 Years a Slave, Africa's Slave Trade, The Story of Frank Among the Rancheros, and African American Poetry. Each text contains sensory descriptions that we have only touched upon. Then, watch documentaries on the incense roots and African games. The
Self-open-ended questions. How did African games influence European games? Why were African spices so coveted? How did African textiles become political symbols? Finally, participate in African cooking or weaving workshops if you have the opportunity. Learning through the senses is the most powerful. Don't hesitate to write to your teacher to share your sensory discoveries. Pan-Africanism is a living history, and you can contribute to it by living it yourself.